Hello, my name is Ginger Berg, and I am a student at Fort Hays State University. And this presentation is about a case study that was entitled, Who Should Create the School's Vision? In this case study, I am starring as the new principal hired to lead a middle school that is currently being built in a predominantly rural community. An advisory committee has been formed, and our first goal is to collaboratively draft philosophy and vision statements for the new school. This case study includes the following stakeholders: an advisory committee made up of 4 parents, 4 teachers, and myself, the school board, the superintendent, all the middle school parents, and all the middle school students. The conflict arises when 7 of the advisory committee members want me to draft the philosophy and vision statements on my own, and then the committee will give me feedback on those statements I've given them. I, on the other hand, want all of the stakeholders collaborating together to design these statements. Although this case study does not have legal issues, there are some ethical issues. The first is that if I draft these statements alone and then the committee discusses them, are we truly collaboratively designing the mission and vision statements? The second is that without input from all stakeholders, how can I create statements that accurately reflect a core set of values and priorities? Thirdly, how do I respect the democratic vote of the committee while still accomplishing the goal of collaboration of all stakeholders? As the principal, I must decide if I'm going to go along with the popular vote of the advisory committee and draft the philosophy and vision statements on my own, or if I will instead have all the stakeholders collaborate together on these statements in order to ensure they reflect a core set of values and priorities that represent the community and the new school. Before I decide what to do, I need to look at all the facts. The people involved in this case include Helen Burke, who is a teacher and the advisory committee chair. Dan Kelby is another teacher on the committee, and there are 2 other teachers that are on the advisory committee. 4 parents are on the committee, and there are 5 school board members involved, one of whom is Helen Burke's brother, Superintendent Joe Rawlings, and the rest of the community members, which include students and parents. The place is Lightville, which serves 2 rural townships, and about 60% of the residents still live on farms. However, it is a growing community. The program is a public middle school program, and the school is brand new. In fact, it has not even finished being built yet. After reviewing the facts, I reached the following conclusions. The first is, if I do not handle this conflict correctly, it could damage the cohesiveness of my new staff and could also affect my relationship with the school board, superintendent, and community at large. Second, I have not consulted with these following stakeholders: the superintendent, the board members, students, the rest of the teachers, and all of the parents. Thirdly, I believe I have enough information to make a decision without having to consult with every stakeholder first. I have therefore arrived at these possible options to solve this conflict. The first is to just do what the advisory committee wants and draft the statements myself. Secondly, I can tell the committee we're going to go with my original plan, and we'll be creating these collaboratively, following the steps that I had laid out at the last meeting. Third, I could bring 3 or 4 example statements to the next meeting to get feedback and then go from there to draft the statements. I could also survey the community and board and then bring this information to the next meeting in order to have us together create these statements as a committee. Lastly, I could do a brainstorm session with the committee in order to establish together the core values and priorities and use these to establish the statements based on what we discuss at this committee meeting. Before I decide, I must look at the pros and cons of each option. Let's start with the first option. I could do what the advisory committee wants and draft the statements myself. Some pros are this is what the committee wants, and it would not create any debate or drama in the committee. Some cons: this type of drafting the statements would not represent all stakeholders. It also does not foster collaboration in the committee, and it sets a precedence of top-down decisions, where as a principal, I simply make the decision and everyone follows what I say. If we look at the pros and cons of the second option, which is to tell the committee we are going with my original plan and we'll be creating these collaboratively following the steps I laid out at the last meeting, some pros are it would represent more stakeholders and it would foster collaboration, especially within the committee. Some cons are the committee has already voted against it, and the committee therefore may not be actively involved in this process since they did not have any buy-in. Next, let's look at the pros and cons of my third option, which is to bring 3 or 4 example statements to the next meeting to get feedback and then go from there to draft the statements. The pros are that this is closer to what the committee had voted on. It also gives us a starting place to draft these statements, and it does allow for collaboration. Some cons are that by starting with others' completed statements, it limits the creativity of the group. The committee also may still resist this idea because that is not what they had voted on. If we look at the pros and cons of the fourth option, which is to survey the community and board and then bring this information to the next meeting in order to together create the statements, pros are it involves even more stakeholders and allows great collaboration, and it will also more closely reflect the values and priorities of the whole community. Cons, the committee may resist it as it is not what they voted for. The community and board members may not buy in and give good feedback. Also, by involving more people, the conflict about this issue may spread. Lastly, let's look at the pros and cons of my final option, and that is to do a brainstorm session with the committee to establish together the core values and priorities and use these to establish the statements based on what is discussed in this meeting. Pros is it gives the committee input in the process as a collaborative team, but I would still draft the actual statements, which is what they had wanted after we do this session. Cons, the committee may resist it as it's not what they had wanted in the first place. Also, they may not want to participate in this brainstorm session. After weighing all the choices, I choose my final option to do a brainstorm session with the committee in order to establish together the core values and priorities and use these to establish the statements based on what we brainstorm and discuss. My next steps that I need to take are first, I need to talk to the chairperson about the need to get input from those who know the community. Then with the committee, I will be leading a brainstorm session about the core values and priorities of the community and new school. It is possible that the chairperson and the committee will not be happy about this choice, and I will need to convince them of the importance of the collaboration. I also need to set forth the brainstorming rules when we do that in the committee and have a procedure already ready and start the brainstorming myself if needed in order to encourage input. Once we are done brainstorming, we will together as a committee take all of the brainstorm thoughts and collaboratively chunk them into groups in order to establish those core beliefs. I will then take what we have found in that committee and draft the statements based on those core values that we determined, and then bring it back to the committee to discuss and get feedback. Once we as a committee have agreed on the statements, I will present the statements to the board, community, and other stakeholders in order to get their feedback and input. I have to make sure that the others don't just rubber stamp what we came up with, and we'll need to encourage adequate feedback and input.